The split logs hit frozen ground with sounds like rifle shots. February in Montana Territory, 1873, and the thermometer outside Ingrid Halverson's cabin door read 12 below zero. She didn't look up from her work, just kept swinging the maul in that rhythm she'd learned back in her father's timber camp in Minnesota, the same motion repeated 10,000 times until the body moved without asking permission from the mind. Swing, listen for the crack, swing again. The rhythm was everything. The rhythm was survival. The sun sat low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow that had turned the entire landscape into something that looked more like the surface of another world than a place where humans were supposed to live. The sky was cloudless and impossibly blue, the kind of blue that only exists when the air is so cold and dry that moisture crystallizes into tiny ice particles that catch the light and fracture it into colors that shouldn't exist together. Behind her, stacked against the north wall of her cabin, 3 cords of firewood sat buried under 4 feet of snow that had fallen in the past 6 days. She couldn't reach it. Her 2 children were inside coughing with fever, and she had maybe 6 hours of split wood left in the house. That was when Jonas Pritchard rode up through the drifts on his big wrangling horse and told her she was doing it all wrong. Pritchard ran the largest homestead in the Bitterroot Valley, 320 acres of proved land, with cattle that actually survived winters. He'd been there since 1867, back when the valley still had Salish hunting camps and no roads worth mentioning. A man didn't last 6 Montana winters without knowing his business. He carried that knowledge like armor, the kind of certainty that comes from being right more often than wrong, and from never having to question whether your solutions would work for someone else's life. His horse was a good animal, well-fed and muscled, the kind of animal that belonged to someone with resources. He dismounted, ground-tied his horse, and walked over to where Ingrid was splitting the green lodgepole pine she'd hauled down from the ridge in November. The snow crunched under his boots, a sound like breaking glass multiplied 1,000 times. He moved with the easy confidence of someone whose problems had always been solvable by hiring help or using resources or calling on neighbors who owed him favors. When he spoke, his breath came out in clouds that hung in the still air, like physical proof of his warnings, visible evidence of the danger he was about to describe. "You stack your wood against the cabin like that, you're asking for trouble," he said. His voice was the voice of someone accustomed to being listened to, someone who rarely had to repeat himself, because his first statement carried the weight of experience. Snow slides off that roof, buries everything. Wood gets wet, draws moisture into your logs, rots the whole structure from the bottom up. I've seen it happen to 3 homesteads in this valley alone. 3 times I've watched people work themselves into graves because they made the same mistake you're making right now. Ingrid sank her maul into the chopping block and straightened up. She was 28 years old, 5 feet 4 inches tall, with hands that showed every blister and callus from the 16 months she'd been proving this claim. Her husband, Eric, had died of typhoid that first summer, 2 weeks after they'd finished the cabin. Left her with 80 acres of sagebrush and pine, 2 children under 6, and a growing season that lasted maybe 90 days if you were lucky. The kind of hand she'd been dealt with no option to fold and no one to call for advice on how to proceed. Her face was weathered beyond her years, from sun and wind and cold. There were lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before Eric died, lines that had been carved by worry and exhaustion and the constant calculation of whether what she was doing today was enough to ensure that her children would be alive next week. Her hair was pulled back severely, not for fashion, but because it was practical. Everything about Ingrid was practical. She wore a man's shirt under her dress, and her hands were wrapped in cloth strips that had been part of a petticoat 3 months ago. "Mr. Pritchard," she said, her voice steady in a way that had nothing to do with confidence and everything to do with exhaustion. "I appreciate your concern, but I didn't stack it there because I'm foolish. I stacked it there because I'm alone." He looked at her like she'd spoken Norwegian instead of English, which she had also spoken that morning to her daughter Anna, who'd fallen asleep crying with fever. Pritchard had 3 grown sons and 2 hired men living in his bunkhouse. When he needed firewood in a blizzard, he sent someone to fetch it. The question of what you did when you were the someone never seemed to occur to him. It wasn't that he was unkind. He simply had never existed in a world where his problem was also his only solution. "Ma'am," he said, his patience showing the first small cracks like ice beginning to form on a winter lake when it's 30 below, and the wind's blowing so hard you can't see your barn from your door. I need my firewood within 10 feet of where I sleep. Not in some shed 50 yards away, not buried somewhere I have to dig for an hour to reach. Right there. She pointed at the wall where she could grab it, even if there's a blizzard that lasts 4 days. She spoke with the precision of someone who had calculated this problem extensively, who had spent sleepless nights thinking about distances and times and the mathematics of survival. I've timed it. 17 minutes last winter to dig through snow to reach wood stacked just 20 feet from the door. In that cold, your fingers stop working after about 10 minutes. Your mind starts going strange around minute 12. You start making mistakes, taking wrong turns. At 17 minutes, you're starting to not care whether you make it back or not. That's not a good place to be when your children are alone in the dark. The implications of what she was saying seemed to land on Pritchard with some force. He looked at her hands, at the carefully wrapped cloth covering blisters and calluses, at the evidence of labor that had never been part of his calculation of what a woman alone with children should be doing. Pritchard shook his head with the expression of a man whose certainty was being questioned and had never learned how to handle that particular sensation. "You'll lose the whole cabin that way," he said. His voice carried the weight of conviction based on observation. "Water damage, rot, then you're rebuilding from scratch. I've seen it happen. I've watched the whole structure come down. I've seen people standing in the snow looking at the remains of what they thought was secure, realizing that they made a choice that seemed smart at the time, but turned out to be fatal. And I've seen women freeze to death trying to reach distant wood piles in storms," Ingrid said. She picked up her maul again, and the gesture was one of returning to work, of dismissing him, not disrespectfully, but with finality. "I've seen it happen too. Different way of dying, but dying just the same. I'll take my chances with the rot." He rode off shaking his head, probably figuring she'd learned the hard way like all stubborn homesteaders did. Stubborn was what happened to you when you ran out of good options and had to keep going anyway. Ingrid stood there in the cold, listening to her children cough inside the cabin, watching the sun drop behind the Bitterroot Mountains like it was going down for the last time, and started thinking about a problem that would kill her family if she didn't solve it right. She understood what Pritchard was saying. He wasn't wrong about the moisture. Stack firewood directly against log walls, and moisture does wick into the wood. In a climate that dropped to 40 below in January, where timber was the only building material for 100 miles in any direction, losing your cabin to rot meant losing everything. Every shelter you had, every security you'd managed to build with your own hands gone. The kind of failure that didn't just end your homestead, it ended your children. It ended you. It turned survival into a slowly unfolding disaster. But Pritchard wasn't right either, and that was the part he couldn't see from the vantage point of his life with hired help and grown sons. His solution made perfect sense for his life, which was why it made no sense for hers. When he needed firewood in a blizzard, he sent someone else. When Ingrid needed firewood in a blizzard, she had to leave her sick children alone in a dark cabin and fight through drifts that sometimes reached her shoulders. The gap between those two situations was so wide that all the expertise in Montana couldn't bridge it. Expertise designed for one set of circumstances rarely helped when you were facing a completely different set of constraints. The cabin was small, 16 feet by 20 feet inside dimensions, 7-foot walls, a steep pitched roof covered with hand-split shakes and a layer of sod for insulation. The door was heavy and had to be kept closed against the cold. The fire was in the middle of the space and smoke rose through a hole in the roof. When Ingrid had to leave the cabin to get firewood, she was closing the door on 2 children. She was leaving them with a fire that would burn down if she didn't return. She was leaving them with darkness because by the time she finished digging to firewood and bringing it back, the sun would be setting or already down. She was calculating whether it was safer to risk her own freezing by spending 20 minutes or more out in extreme cold, or to risk them freezing by letting the fire burn low. That was the choice that Pritchard's advice forced her to make every time winter came. Early March brought a night that would lodge itself in Ingrid's mind, like a seed in frozen ground waiting for warmth and moisture and the right conditions to grow into something that would transform her entire understanding of what was possible. Her daughter Anna's fever spiked to 104 degrees on a Tuesday night, the kind of heat that meant something had shifted in the child's body, some internal alarm that signaled danger beyond the ordinary sickness that children got and usually recovered from if you kept them warm and fed them broth. Ingrid had no doctor closer than Fort Benton, 87 miles north through mountain passes that wouldn't clear until May. She spent that night alternating between stoking the fire to keep the cabin warm enough for a fevered child and bathing Anna with snowmelt water that had been warmed as close to the heat as Ingrid could hold the cloth without burning her fingers. The water was as warm as she could make it, but it was still cold by any normal standard. She used cloth strips torn from her own clothes, the underthings that she had no use for anyway, and she worked with the focused intensity of someone who understood that this night might determine whether her daughter lived or died. Around 3 in the morning, when the darkness was most complete and her mind had moved past fear into a kind of focused emptiness that sometimes comes from extreme exhaustion and extreme purpose. Simultaneously, Ingrid looked at that cabin wall and saw something different. The wall was made of logs that Eric had carefully selected and shaped. He'd been a good carpenter, careful with his work, and he'd taken pride in fitting the logs together properly. The chinking between the logs was clay and dry grass, and it held well. The wall was solid. It was as solid as anything Eric had ever built, which meant it was as solid as a man who understood timber and craftsmanship could make it. But the wall was also the thing that trapped her in a binary choice. Either the firewood was far from the cabin, which meant she had to risk her life to reach it in a blizzard, or the firewood was close to the cabin, which meant it was rotting it from the outside and undermining its structural integrity day by day, week by week, season by season, until eventually the whole thing failed. What if the walls weren't the boundaries she thought, though she couldn't articulate it, then exhausted and scared as she was bathing her fevered daughter with cloth soaked in water that was only slightly less cold than the air outside? What if you built around the problem instead of against it? What if you created space, a gap, air, something between the wood and the cabin that wasn't either wall, wasn't either structure, but somehow part of both? What if the solution to the problem wasn't choosing between two bad options, but creating a third option that people hadn't tried before because it seemed impossible until someone desperate enough to try impossible things came along? The idea lodged itself in her mind like that seed waiting for conditions that would make it grow. It sat there at the edge of consciousness while she worked through the rest of that night, tending to her daughter, feeding the fire, praying to a God she wasn't sure was listening. It was still there when the fever finally broke on Thursday morning, and Anna opened her eyes and asked for water. By Saturday, Ingrid was up on the ridge again this time, looking at the standing timber with different eyes. She'd need maybe another 3 cords of logs greenwood, heavy as sin, and she'd have to drag it down alone because her horse had come up lame the previous week. But if this worked, if what she was imagining could actually be built, if she could somehow translate the thought that had come to her in the depths of the night into something physical and real and functional, she'd never again have to choose between rot and freezing. She'd never again have to leave her children alone in darkness while she fought through storms to save their lives. She would have solved the problem that Pritchard couldn't even see, the problem that only women alone with children had to face. Here's where you need to understand something about frontier women in the 1870s that doesn't make it into most history books. They weren't pioneers because they wanted to be. They weren't adventurers seeking glory or independence or any of the things that male settlers claimed to want. They were pioneers because their husbands got gold fever or land fever or just plain wanderlust. Because a man in their life had decided that there was something out west worth leaving everything for, and they either came along or stayed behind and lost their husband and their marriage and their place in their family's economic structure. And when those husbands died, which they did with remarkable frequency, from disease and accident and simple bad luck, the women had a choice. Abandon the claim and head back east with nothing, no resources, no way to support themselves and their children. Start over in a world that had very limited options for women. Or prove up the land and own something that couldn't be taken away, something that couldn't be taken by a husband or a father or a brother, or the simple misfortune of circumstances beyond your control. Ingrid Halverson chose the second option, which meant she needed to learn carpentry, animal husbandry, agriculture, hunting, and survival skills that most men never mastered. And she needed to learn them while keeping 2 children alive in a place where winter could kill you in 30 minutes if you made one mistake. She needed to learn them while managing grief, while managing exhaustion, while managing the constant fear that she wouldn't be good enough at all of these things, that she would make a mistake and lose everything. The first log came down on a Tuesday in mid-March. Ingrid felled a lodgepole pine that had been dead maybe 2 years, dry enough to work with but not so rotten it had split wrong or started crumbling at the core. 32 feet long, maybe 14 inches at the butt. She limbed it with her husband's broad axe, a tool that was heavier than anything designed specifically for women's work had any right to be, but that did the job faster and cleaner than smaller alternatives. Then she rigged a drag harness she'd improvised from plow traces and spare leather, the kind of improvisation that came from having to solve problems with what you had rather than what you wished you had. Took her 6 hours to haul that log down the ridge to her cabin, and she only managed it because the spring melt hadn't started yet and the snow was still packed hard enough to slide timber across. Her hands blistered despite the leather wrap. Her shoulders burned with a pain that went deeper than muscle that felt like it was located in the bone itself. By the time she got the log positioned beside the cabin, the sun was setting and she was so tired that she had to sit down in the snow just to remember how to breathe normally. By the end of that week, she had 9 logs staged beside her cabin. By the end of the next week, she had 23. Her hands bled through the rags she'd wrapped them in. Her shoulders felt like they'd been beaten with hammers. But she kept dragging timber down that ridge because she could see the thing now fully formed in her mind, complete in every detail. And it made sense in a way that Jonas Pritchard's advice never would. It made sense in a way that felt like it was reaching forward into the future, solving a problem that nobody else had needed to solve because nobody else had her exact situation. She was going to build a second structure around her cabin. Not a separate shed, not an addition bolted onto the side like an afterthought, a complete outer wall that would stand 3 feet out from the cabin on 3 sides, creating a covered space between the structures. The north side she'd leave open. That's where the prevailing storms came from, and she needed the cabin wall itself to block that wind. But the southeast and west sides would all have this protective shell. The firewood would stack in that gap covered by the extended roof line close enough to reach in any weather, but separated from the cabin walls by an airspace that would prevent moisture transfer. The air would flow through, the damp would evaporate, the wood would stay dry, the cabin would stay sound, and she would be able to reach fuel without having to do the mathematics of exposure and risk every time winter came. When she tried to explain this to Samuel Rohr in late March, he laughed so hard he had to sit down. Rohr was a carpenter who'd worked on buildings from St. Louis to Sacramento before settling in the Bitterroot to raise sheep. He'd helped Eric frame their cabin back in the summer of '71, 5 years ago, in a time that felt like it was a different lifetime. He knew timber construction the way some men knew scripture, with the kind of intimate knowledge that came from decades of practice and mistakes and learning what worked and what didn't work. He was also 63 years old, had buried 2 wives and a son, and he didn't suffer fools kindly. He suffered people who were wrong even less kindly than he suffered fools. He was standing on her porch looking at a piece of birch bark she'd sketched her idea on with a charcoal stick, and his shoulders were shaking with laughter that came partly from genuine amusement and partly from the accumulated weight of having been wrong about buildings before and learned expensive lessons from those mistakes. The laughter faded as he actually looked at what she'd drawn as he traced the lines with a weathered finger as he began to understand what she was actually proposing. "Mrs. Halverson," he said when he could breathe again, and the laughter had subsided into occasional chuckles. "You're describing a building inside a building. Do you have any idea what that'll do to your roof structure? The weight, the complexity of the framing. The engineering problems alone would make a trained architect question whether it was worth attempting." "I've thought about the weight," Ingrid said. They were standing in her cabin now, and she pointed out the lines she'd drawn on the birch bark, the measurements she'd carefully marked in charcoal, the proportions that had come from studying the existing cabin and imagining how to extend it. "The outer posts bear their own load. They don't touch the cabin except where I tie them in for stability. The roof extension is just an outrigger from the existing ridgepole. It's the same principle as a mineshaft prop or a bridge construction technique. Weight goes down. It doesn't transfer sideways to something that isn't designed to bear it." "Just an outrigger," Rohr said, shaking his head, with the expression of someone watching another person walk confidently toward a cliff. "Ma'am, you'd need to sister joist to every rafter, extend them 3 feet beyond the current roof line, then build an entire secondary structure to support that overhang. We're talking about dozens of precision cuts, complex joinery, and engineering that could collapse under the first heavy snow. I've built actual buildings for actual money, and I wouldn't attempt what you're describing. I wouldn't recommend it to another builder. I wouldn't even suggest it as a possibility. It's the kind of thing that sounds good in theory until winter comes and the weight starts adding up and the connections start coming apart. Because it's complicated, Ingrid said quietly, or because I'm a woman. Roar had the grace to look uncomfortable. Because it's dangerous, he said. You make one mistake in those joist extensions, the whole thing could come down, crush your woodpile, maybe damage your cabin, possibly kill someone if they're standing in the wrong place when it fails. There's a reason we build sheds separate from living structures. The reason is that if the shed collapses, you lose the shed. If a shed attached to the cabin collapses, you lose both. You lose the structure that's keeping your family warm and dry. And there's a reason I can't use a separate shed, Ingrid said. Her voice was still quiet, but there was something underneath it, now something that made Roar listen despite himself. She told him about the night with Anna's fever, about the choice between risking her daughter and risking herself in the dark and cold, about the 17 minutes it had taken her to dig through snow to reach wood she'd stacked just 20 feet from the door. She told him about standing there in the dark at 1 a.m, hands bleeding, thinking about giving up and just letting the fire burn down because she was tired enough to not care anymore. She told him about the silence in a dark cabin when a child is sleeping with a fever, and you have to leave that child to save that child, about the weight of that particular fear. Roar listened. His expression changed as she spoke, the layers of skepticism and professional certainty gradually shifting into something more complicated. When she finished, he stood up, walked to the door, and examined the cabin's roof structure from outside. He was out there for maybe 10 minutes, and when he came back in, his expression had changed entirely. He wasn't smiling, he wasn't even close to supportive, but he wasn't dismissing her anymore either. It's madness, he said, but it might work. You'd need to add a crossbeam. Here, he pointed at her a sketch, and here distribute the load properly over multiple posts instead of concentrating it in a few places. And your corner posts would need to go down to bedrock, or they'll heave with frost and tear the whole thing apart. Frost heave will destroy a structure faster than anything else in Montana. The ground expands when it freezes, and if your posts aren't anchored below the frost line, they'll move. Even a quarter-inch of movement can compromise everything. So you'll help me? Ingrid asked. The hope in her voice was fragile, a thin thing that could be broken with the wrong answer. It was the hope of someone who had been told no so many times that she learned to expect it, but still couldn't help but ask when there was even a small chance that yes might be possible. Hell no, Roar said. I'm telling you it's possible. Not volunteering. I've got 300 sheep to shear, and lambing starts next month. I don't have the time to help you build something that might kill you. But I'll give you this. If you somehow manage to build it without killing yourself, you'll have invented something I've never seen before. And I've been framing buildings for 42 years. That's worth something. That's worth remembering. He left her with that half compliment and a detailed list of everything that could go wrong. Ingrid read the list twice, then used it to start her cooking fire. The paper didn't have any information she didn't already know. The dangers were obvious. The potential for failure was real, but she had a name for what she was building now. Not a dream, not a desperate hope, a possibility. The difference between those three things was larger than the distance between Pritchard's ranch and her cabin. The thing about building alone is that it forces you to simplify. Roar had mentioned complex joinery, precision cuts engineering. Ingrid didn't have the skill for complex joinery, the tools for precision cuts, or the education for formal engineering. What she had was an axe, a saw, an auger for drilling holes, and an understanding of weight distribution she'd learned from watching her father build timber scaffolding in Minnesota, logging camps back when she was young enough to think she'd grow up to be something other than what she'd become. Her father had shown her how force moved through structures, how weight could be guided and distributed and directed toward the ground without destroying the thing it was passing through. She started with the corner posts, 4 of them, 10 feet long, milled from the straightest lodgepole she could find. She set them in holes she dug down 4 feet deep enough to get below the frost line, which meant digging through frozen ground that resisted her efforts with every swing of the pick. She packed them with rocks and clay so tight they wouldn't shift in an earthquake. Each post stood exactly 3 feet out from the corresponding cabin corner, measured and remeasured until she was certain. The precision of these measurements became almost sacred to her, a kind of prayer in geometry. If these posts weren't right, nothing that came after would be right either. The entire structure would be compromised from the foundation up. Then came the hard part. The cabin's existing roof rafters were solid, but they ended at the wall plate. To extend that roof line out, Ingrid needed to add extensions to each rafter without weakening the original structure. It was the kind of problem that made experienced carpenters say it was impossible. She couldn't use nails for this connection, didn't have enough of them, and they wouldn't hold that kind of weight anyway. Nails relied on friction and tensile strength. What she needed was a connection that transferred load through direct bearing that used geometry and the properties of wood to move force where it needed to go. So she used a technique she'd seen her father use on bridge construction back in '64. Mortise and tenon joints locked with wooden pegs with the weight transferred through direct bearing rather than fastener strength. It was the kind of joinery that required understanding how wood wanted to move, how force could pass through carefully cut angles into the grain itself. The technique was ancient and proven. The question was whether she had the skill and the time to execute it correctly. It took her 2 weeks to cut and fit the first rafter extension, 2 weeks of climbing up and down a ladder of drilling holes by hand, with an auger that required all her strength to twist into the wood, the kind of effort that came from using your entire body weight, your legs, your back, your arms, all working together to force the tool through resistance. 2 weeks of cutting tenons with a saw and chisel of fitting pieces together and taking them apart when they didn't seat right. 2 weeks of her hands blistering and bleeding and toughening up into something that could handle the work. Her children played in the dirt below, and every time she heard them laugh or argue or cry, she worked faster because this structure was going to keep them alive next winter. It was going to be the difference between comfort and desperation, between choosing and having no choice. It was going to solve a problem that no one else had needed to solve because no one else had her exact situation. The first extension fit with a sound like a door closing solid tight. She pegged it in place and tested the joint by hanging from it with her full weight. It held. It didn't flex or creak or show any sign of stress. It held her 120 pounds, like it was built to hold that and 10 times more. She cut 7 more, and by late April, she had the basic frame completed. 4 corner posts, 8 rafter extensions, and a network of cross beams that tied everything together into a structure that stood independent of the cabin, but braced against it for lateral stability. It looked like a skeleton of some impossible building, a framework that made no sense until you understood the problem it was solving. And when Agnes Miller came by to borrow salt on a Wednesday morning, she just stood there staring at it for a full minute before speaking. Agnes had the look of someone trying to make sense of something that existed outside her normal categories of understanding. "Ing," she said, "finally, what in God's name you building?" Agnes was the closest thing to a friend Ingrid had in the valley. She and her husband Dietrich ran a small farm 2 miles south, and they'd been there since 1869. Agnes had helped deliver Anna when Eric was off proving the claim boundaries, when Ingrid was young enough to believe that this would work out, that having children would bind her to this place in ways that would eventually feel like home rather than exile. She'd brought food after Eric died. She was practical, kind, and not given to unnecessary judgment. But even she looked concerned when she saw what Ingrid had built. "A woodshed," Ingrid said, though they both knew it wasn't really a woodshed. "That's not a woodshed," Agnes said, walking around the structure. Her worn boots crunched in the patches of old snow that still lingered in the shadows, the places where the sun didn't reach and spring hadn't yet arrived. "That's attached to your cabin. You're building a shed attached to your cabin. That's not the same thing as a separate shed." "Around it," Ingrid corrected. 3 sides. The firewood will go in the gap. The north side stays open so the wind can blow through from the prevailing direction. It's designed to protect the wood without trapping moisture. Agnes was quiet for a while, processing the image, trying to see how this thing would actually function in real weather, in real winter. She had her own experience with Montana winters, with the difficulty of staying alive in a place that actively worked against human survival. She understood more than most people what Ingrid was trying to solve. "Won't that trap moisture?" Agnes asked. "Rot the logs. There's 3 feet of airspace, and the wood won't be touching either wall. I'm building racks to hold it suspended. Air circulation on all sides. That's the whole principle. The air moves through the moisture leaves with it. What about the added weight on your roof? That was the practical question, the one that showed Agnes understood the structural considerations. The weight of the roof, plus all that snow, plus the extension. The outer structure carries its own load. Those posts go down to bedrock. The weight doesn't transfer to the cabin, it goes straight down. Agnes walked around again slower this time. She reached out and pushed on one of the corner posts. It didn't budge. She examined the rafter extensions, the joinery, the way the cross beams distributed weight. Finally, she looked at Ingrid with an expression that was equal parts admiration and worry. The worry won out in her expression, the fear that Ingrid was making a mistake that would cost her everything. "You've thought this through," she said. "I've done nothing but think about it for 2 months," Ingrid said. "Every moment I'm not working or caring for the children, I'm thinking about how to make this work. I'm thinking about it when I fall asleep and when I wake up at 3 in the morning." "Dietrich's going to say it's crazy," Agnes said. He was a practical man, good with horses and animals, but not someone who understood building design in the way that carpentry required. Jonas Pritchard already said that. So did Samuel Rohr. Agnes smiled, and there was something in that smile that understood the weight of being dismissed by people whose experience had never forced them to think differently. Well, they're both wrong about half the things they say anyway. You need help with the roof. That's how Ingrid learned that sometimes the best support comes not from the people who know the most, but from the people who understand what you're actually trying to do. Agnes understood desperation the way only another woman could understand it, the way only someone who'd made impossible choices could recognize them in someone else. The roof went up in 3 days. Not because it was simple. It wasn't, but because Agnes brought Dietrich despite his misgivings, and Dietrich brought tools that Ingrid didn't own and skills that she didn't have, and together they figured out how to extend the shake roof out over the new structure in a way that wouldn't leak. They used smaller shakes, overlapped them more tightly, and added a layer of birch bark under everything for extra waterproofing. Ingrid had harvested that birch bark back in March, peeling it in sheets from dead trees up in the draw and storing it flat under rocks so it wouldn't curl. She'd been preparing for this moment even before she fully understood what this moment would be. The final piece was the sod layer. They cut it from the meadow behind the cabin, working in rectangles maybe 2 feet by 3 feet, 4 inches thick, heavy enough that it took 2 people to lift each piece. They laid it over the bark in overlapping courses, and when they were done, Ingrid had a living roof that would shed water, insulate against heat and cold, and hold firm in wind that could peel regular shakes off in minutes. It was the kind of roof that farmers' wives had figured out centuries ago in places where winters tried to kill you. She was simply adapting old knowledge to a new shape, combining techniques that had been proven over generations with an application that was entirely her own. By May 1st, the structure was complete. From a distance, the cabin appeared to be wearing a strange wooden coat, or maybe sitting inside a larger building that someone had forgotten to finish. Up close, you could see the craftsmanship, rough but functional, the kind of work that comes from understanding necessity better than technique. The southeast and west walls of the cabin now had protection. 3 feet of covered space on each side open to air circulation, but sheltered from rain and snow. Ingrid built simple racks from scrap lumber, horizontal poles resting in notched uprights that would hold stacked firewood up off the ground and away from both walls. The north side remained exposed, taking the brunt of the winter storms, but keeping the cabin's thermal mass concentrated where it mattered most. She spent the next week stacking the firewood she'd split through the winter. 3 cords of lodgepole, 2 cords of Douglas fir, half a cord of aspen for quick-burning kindling. It all fit in those protected spaces with room to spare for the additional wood she'd need to cut come fall. And for the first time since Eric died, looking at that wood pile didn't fill her with dread about the coming winter. The dread was still there underneath everything because Montana winters didn't care about your preparations or your cleverness. But there was something else now, too. Something that felt almost like hope, something that felt like maybe she was going to make it through this. Maybe her children were going to make it through this. Maybe she'd actually solved a problem that the experts had told her was unsolvable. Summer passed the way Montana summers did, too fast and never quite warm enough. The calendar said it was June, but the nights still dropped below freezing. Ingrid got her garden established anyway, hauling water by hand to nurture the few crops that might mature in 90 days. She built small structures around the plants to protect them from frost. Hay cut and stored for the animals. Cabin repairs completed before the rain came. She hunted sage grouse and prairie chickens, and when Dietrich shot a deer and offered to share, she smoked the venison over a careful fire, producing strips of meat that would last until winter. Put up wild berries in clay jars sealed with rendered fat, a technique that had kept people alive for centuries. Every spare hour went to firewood. She cut and split and stacked until those covered spaces on three sides of her cabin were absolutely full-packed tight with enough fuel to burn continuously from November through April if she needed to. Her back knew every ache of this work. Her hands had calluses on top of calluses, layers of protection that her body was building against the constant assault of labor. She stopped noticing when she was cold because she was always cold in the mornings and evenings. She stopped noticing when she was hungry because there was never enough food to feel full. The work became a kind of meditation, the repeated motion of swinging the maul, the sound of wood splitting, the physical satisfaction of stacking another piece of security against the coming winter. This was the knowledge that history books didn't capture. Not the clever engineering or the innovative design, but the sheer brutal persistence of it. The willingness to do the same motion 10,000 times. To keep working when your shoulders screamed and your hands bled and the work seemed never ending. To keep working because the alternative was death. Not metaphorical death, not failure or embarrassment or loss of status. Actual, literal, your children freezing in a cabin death. By late summer, something unexpected happened. People started asking her about the structure. Not with skepticism this time, but with genuine curiosity. Word traveled through the scattered homesteads of the Bitterroot Valley the way all significant things traveled through isolated communities. Ingrid had built something unusual and it hadn't fallen down. More than that, it seemed to be working. The firewood she'd stored in the protected spaces wasn't rotting. The cabin wall behind it wasn't showing any sign of moisture damage. The air gap was doing exactly what she'd calculated it would do. By early September, 3 different homesteaders had ridden out to look at it. They asked questions about the posts, the measurements, the technique. They wanted to understand not just what she'd built, but why she'd built it that way. The kind of questions that assume the builder knows something worth knowing. The kind of questions that treat innovation as normal instead of impossible. One of those homesteaders was a man named Charles Whitmore, who ran cattle about 8 miles north and had never been particularly friendly to Ingrid. He looked at the structure for a long time without speaking, walking around it, studying the joints, examining how the weight distributed. When he finally spoke, his voice carried something like respect, or at least the beginning of respect. "How much weight you reckon that can hold?" he asked, pointing at the roof extension. "More than I'll ever put on it," Ingrid said. "I built it for Montana winter snow load. Everything else is just bonus. The structure has been up since May. It's held through spring storms. It'll hold through winter." Whitmore nodded slowly, and you could see him calculating the design, understanding how it works, seeing its potential. "I'm going to build one of these. Not exactly like this, maybe some modifications for my situation. But this principle, this idea of protecting the fuel without destroying the structure. It's smart. It's smarter than anything I've been doing." He didn't ask permission. He didn't need to. The idea was out, now lived in, proven by actual experience. It belonged to the world in a way that intellectual property never quite managed. You couldn't own an idea that was also a solution to a universal problem. By early September, word had spread to 3 different families in the valley, all planning their own versions. The principle was sound, and it didn't belong to Ingrid anymore. It belonged to anyone desperate enough to think about building it, anyone wise enough to see that the traditional solution wasn't working for their situation. June came and brought visitors who didn't appreciate innovation quite as much as they appreciated conformity. Reverend Thomas Blackwell rode up on a Sunday morning with 2 of his congregation, Martin Thorson and Rebecca Palmer, and they weren't there to admire the carpentry. Blackwell ran the Lutheran mission that served the scattered homesteads from the Bitterroot to the Flathead, and he took his role as moral authority seriously. Too seriously in the opinion of most people who actually had to live and work in the territory. He was a man in his 50s with the kind of certainty that comes from belief, from the conviction that he understood the moral order of the world and that his job was to enforce it. "Mrs. Halverson," he said, not bothering to dismount, "I've received complaints about your building project. Ingrid was hoeing her garden trying to get squash and beans established before the short growing season ran out. She stopped, leaned on the hoe, and looked up at him. There was no fear in her expression yet, only tiredness. She'd been working since before sunrise, as she did every day. Complaints about what exactly, she asked. About an unconventional structure that violates common building practices and presents a fire hazard to neighboring properties, Blackwell said. He gestured at the structure like he was indicating evidence of sin, like the very existence of it was a moral failing. I'm told you've built wooden walls directly adjacent to your living space, creating a fire trap that could spread to other homesteads if ignited. The nearest homestead is 2 miles away, Ingrid said, and the walls aren't directly adjacent. There's 3 feet of space between them. 3 feet filled with dry firewood, Martin Thorson said. He was a thick-shouldered Norwegian who ran a mining claim up in the mountains and came down to the valley every few weeks for supplies. You're storing kindling next to your cabin. That's asking for trouble. That's asking for a fire that will burn your cabin down and maybe spread to the rest of us if the wind is blowing the right way. I'm storing firewood in a covered, ventilated space, Ingrid said. Same as everyone else. Mine's just closer to where I need it. The ventilation prevents the moisture accumulation that could cause rot. The 3-foot gap provides protection from wind and precipitation while allowing air circulation to prevent moisture buildup. It's functionally the same as any other wood storage system, just with a different orientation. Rebecca Palmer spoke up then. She was maybe 40 years old, a widow who'd proved her own claim in the northern part of the valley and had strong opinions about how things should be done. Her face carried the particular hardness of someone who'd learned that the world didn't care about your good intentions, only about your compliance. There was something in her voice that suggested she understood what Ingrid had built and why she'd built it, but felt obligated to oppose it anyway. Mrs. Halverson, we're not questioning your intentions. We're questioning your judgment. This structure is unusual. Unusual things fail in unexpected ways. When winter comes and you've got a fire burning in that cabin, any spark that escapes could ignite your entire woodpile. A fire like that could burn out of control. It could spread to other properties. It could kill people. Warmer than I'd be without firewood, Ingrid said. It came out sharper than she intended, but she was tired of explaining herself. She was tired of defending choices that made perfect sense to her against the criticism of people who'd never had to make those choices. She was tired of having to justify her own survival. Look, I appreciate your concern, I do, but I built this structure because the alternative was worse. I can keep the firewood away from the cabin and risk freezing when I can't reach it in a storm. Or I can keep it close and risk moisture damage to my walls. This is the third option. It's not unconventional. It's solving a problem you don't have because you're not a woman alone with 2 children and no help for 80 miles. You have neighbors. You have family. You have options. I don't. So I created one. Blackwell's expression didn't change. The words seemed to slide off him like water off the sod roof she'd built. He wasn't interested in her explanation. He was interested in order and conformity, in the idea that there was a proper way of doing things, and that anyone who deviated from that proper way was creating disorder. I understand your situation is difficult, he said, his voice carrying no actual understanding whatsoever. But difficulty doesn't excuse recklessness. I'm asking you to dismantle this structure before winter arrives and build a proper separate shed like every other homesteader in this valley. I'm asking you to be reasonable. And if I don't, Ingrid asked, though she already knew the answer. She could see it in his face, in the way he carried himself, in the absolute certainty that he had the right to make demands of her and the authority to enforce them. Then I'll be forced to bring this matter before the Territorial Land Office, Blackwell said. His voice took on the tone of someone delivering bad news that he was in his own mind reluctant to deliver, but obligated to do so. Your claim is still provisional. You haven't proved up yet. If they determine you're maintaining an unsafe structure, they could revoke your patent. That hit different. That hit in the place where all her calculations and cleverness and desperation lived. Ingrid had 9 more months before she could file for her final patent. 9 months of continuous residence and improvement. The legal requirement was being on the land doing things to improve it, making it into something of value. She'd been doing that for 16 months now. 16 months of labor, of grief, of survival, all leading to the moment when she could file and become the legal owner of this 80 acres. The 80 acres that would be hers, not Eric's, not any man's. Hers. And if the land office decided she was creating a hazard, if Blackwell filed an official complaint, if the wrong bureaucrat looked at his report and decided it was easier to revoke her claim than to defend her right to keep it, she would lose everything, every hour of work, every decision made in desperation, every innovation created out of necessity. All of it would be taken away and the land would go to someone else, someone with more resources, someone without 2 children and a mortgage of grief. "I'll think about it," Ingrid said, because she didn't know what else to say. "You do that," Blackwell said. He turned his horse and started to ride away, satisfied that he'd made his point, convinced that his authority had been recognized and would be obeyed. Ingrid went back to hoeing her garden, but her hands were shaking now, and she couldn't make them stop. The work became mechanical, one foot in front of the other, the hoe rising and falling, but her mind was somewhere else entirely, running through scenarios, calculating risks, trying to figure out what happened when the thing that saved your life became the thing that destroyed it. That night, after the children were asleep, she sat outside and looked at the structure she'd built. In the fading light, it looked solid, permanent, like it had been there as long as the cabin itself. She'd put 2 months of brutal labor into this thing, learned skills she didn't know existed, solved problems that would have broken most people. She'd proven that her idea could be executed. She'd proven that it worked. She'd proven that she was capable of solving the problem that the experts had said was unsolvable. She could dismantle it, stack the lumber, use it for something else, build a conventional shed out past the barn like Blackwell wanted. It would be safer, legally speaking, simpler, less likely to draw attention, more acceptable to the eyes of men who'd never had to choose between impossible options, more in line with what other people thought a woman alone with children should be doing, more convenient for people like Blackwell, who preferred order and conformity in the traditional way of doing things. But it wouldn't work. Not for her specific situation, not for the mathematics of her survival, not for the 17 minutes, not for the 17 minutes that stood between her and the decision to just let the fire burn low and the cold take care of things. And somewhere in Ingrid Halverson's exhausted, determined mind, a decision crystallized that would define the rest of her time in Montana Territory. She'd prove them wrong, not by arguing with them, not by trying to convince them that their concerns were misguided, not by appealing to some higher sense of fairness or reason. She would prove them wrong the only way that mattered on the frontier. By surviving, by making it through the winter, by having her children alive and healthy on the other side of April, by standing there in May with woods still in the protected spaces and no fire, no rot, no disaster, by existing as proof that her calculation had been correct. September brought the first hard freeze. The ground turned solid, and Ingrid could feel the shift in the season, the way the angle of sunlight changed, the way the air started carrying a different weight. October brought 6 inches of snow that melted in 2 days, a reminder and a warning about what was coming. The animals began to behave differently, sensing something in the air that the calendar hadn't quite reached yet. November brought the moment of truth that would settle everything. The moment that would prove whether she'd been right or whether she'd been a fool. The moment that would determine whether Blackwell could take her claim or whether she'd earned the right to keep it. The first real storm hit on November 19th, a Tuesday. Ingrid woke to darkness and cold and the sound of wind that seemed to come from every direction at once. The thermometer outside her cabin door read 18 degrees at dawn. By noon, it was down to 8. By sunset, it was below 0, and the wind was gusting hard enough to shake the cabin walls. The snow didn't fall so much as fly horizontally, driven by wind that had come straight down from the Arctic without anything to slow it down. Within 6 hours, drifts were building against the north wall of her cabin, piling up 4 feet, then 6 feet, then 8 feet high. The snow seemed inexhaustible, coming from an infinite supply somewhere above the clouds. But on the south and east and west sides, where her wooden shell created that protected gap, something happened exactly as she designed it. The drift stopped at the outer wall. The covered space stayed mostly clear. The airspace she'd designed was actually doing what she'd designed it to do. Ingrid's children, wrapped in quilts and furs, stayed close to the fire that she kept burning continuously. She had to burn through fuel at a rate that would have terrified her just days before running the fire hot enough to keep the cabin temperature above 40 degrees, when outside the thermometer was dropping toward 23 below 0, dropping toward the temperature that could kill a human being in less than an hour. Every 4 hours, she needed to restock the firewood inside the cabin, which meant leaving the warmth and stepping out into cold that could kill in 30 minutes if you weren't careful. And every 4 hours, she could step outside, reach into that protected space, and grab split logs without having to dig through 8 feet of snow, without having to spend 30 minutes excavating a frozen woodpile, without having to fight through drifts that could swallow a grown woman whole. The design worked. Everything she'd imagined, calculated, and built with her own hands actually worked exactly as she'd imagined it. This was what the other homesteaders didn't understand. It wasn't just about convenience or being smart or innovative or clever. It was about the mathematics of survival. Exposure kills. The longer you're out in extreme cold, the higher the probability that you won't come back. Every minute outside was a minute your children were alone in the dark, a minute their fire might burn down, a minute something could happen that you wouldn't be there to prevent. Every trip to the distant woodpile was a calculated risk that something would go wrong. You'd fall. You'd get turned around in the white noise of the blizzard. You'd come back to the cabin and realize you were already starting to freeze, your fingers numb, your thoughts getting slow. Ingrid's system didn't eliminate the risk, but it compressed it. Compressed the time outside, compressed the distance she had to travel, compressed the window for disaster. Instead of a 17-minute excavation of a snow-buried woodpile, she had a 30-second reach into a covered space. The difference between those two scenarios was the difference between managing and failing between her children having a mother on the 5th day and them not. For 4 days, the storm raged with a fury that seemed personal, seemed designed to test every calculation and assumption she'd made about whether her structure would hold, whether her design would work, whether she'd made the right choice in building something that everyone else had said was impossible. The temperature dropped to 23 below zero on the 3rd night. The wind blew so hard that standing outside felt like being pushed by invisible hands, like the weather itself had weight and intention. Ingrid's children stayed inside wrapped in quilts close to the fire that never stopped burning. And every 4 hours she went out into that covered space and brought in fuel without having to risk her life to do it. On the 4th day, she was exhausted beyond any measurement, running on something deeper than adrenaline, on the pure animal instinct to survive and keep her children alive. But the system was working. The structure was holding. The design was proving itself with every trip to the woodpile, with every handful of dry wood that she could reach without digging. On the 5th day, the storm broke. The sun came out into a sky so blue it hurt to look at, and the temperature climbed all the way to 15 degrees, which felt tropical in comparison to what had come before. Ingrid stepped outside for the first time in 4 days, and the world had been remade. The north side of her cabin was surrounded by a monument of snow 10 feet high, in places smooth and sculpted by the wind into patterns that were almost beautiful. But the south side, the east side, the west side, where her structure protected the firewood, the spaces were mostly clear. The design had worked. Everything she'd imagined, calculated, and built with her own hands had actually worked. When Jonas Pritchard rode by that afternoon to check if she'd survived, he found Ingrid outside splitting more wood to replace what she'd burned. Her face was windburned. Her hands were wrapped in rags that had once been cloth, and there was something in her expression that suggested she'd just come through something that changed how she understood the world and her place in it. She was moving slowly, but she was moving. She was standing. She was alive. Her children were alive behind her in the cabin. "Mrs. Halverson," he said, and his voice had a quality she hadn't heard before. Something like respect, something like humility, something like the beginning of understanding what he'd gotten wrong back in February. "I'll be damned." She sank her maul into the block and straightened up, looking at him. Her back was straight, despite the exhaustion. Her eyes were clear, despite 4 days of minimal sleep and maximum stress. "Something I can help you with?" she asked. He looked at her structure, at the firewood, still neatly stacked in those covered spaces protected from the wind and snow by the design she'd created. He looked at the cabin, showing no sign of moisture damage or rot, the structure still sound, still strong. He looked at his own hands, chapped and bleeding from the digging he'd had to do to reach his own woodpile after the storm, the physical evidence of what her solution had prevented him from experiencing. You could see the math of it in his face, the moment when understanding arrived with the force of something that had been obvious all along, but required experience to see. You could see the moment when he realized that he'd been wrong, that his expertise, which had served him well in the circumstances of his life with help and resources, had been inadequate to address the problem that Ingrid had faced. "You mind if I look at how you built this?" he asked. She showed him, explained the corner posts and how they went down to bedrock, how they distributed their own load. She showed him the mortise and tenon joints locked with wooden pegs, the way weight transferred through direct bearing rather than fastener strength. She explained the cross beams and the sod roof, with its layer of birch bark underneath. She showed him how the weight distributed, how the snow load traveled through the structure without putting stress on the cabin itself. He listened like a man hearing gospel for the first time, asking questions about measurements and materials and techniques. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, standing there in the cold, looking at what she'd built, understanding what it meant. "I was wrong," he said finally. His voice carried the weight of that admission, the weight of having to confront the fact that his certainty had been based on circumstances, not wisdom. "What you told me back in February about needing the wood close, I thought you were being stubborn, being unreasonable, not understanding the danger of moisture and rot. But you were solving a different problem than I had. I've got help. Sons, hired men. When I need firewood in a blizzard, I send someone. You don't. You have to go yourself. Changes everything." "It does," Ingrid said. "I'm going to build one of these," Pritchard said. "Not because I need it the way you do, but because it's smarter than what I've been doing. You mind if I tell others about it?" "Tell whoever you want," Ingrid said. And he did. Word traveled through the Bitterroot Valley the way all significant things traveled through isolated communities. By Christmas, 3 other homesteaders had built similar structures. By spring, it was 7. They called them different things: Woodshells cabin, coats, Halverson sheds, but they all solved the same problem that Ingrid had identified that desperate night with Anna's fever. Keep fuel close, keep it dry, keep it accessible regardless of weather. Solve the problem the way your specific situation demanded, not the way convention suggested. The Territorial Land Office never did come after her claim. Whether Blackwell dropped his complaint or whether they simply didn't care about an isolated homestead's unconventional architecture, Ingrid never found out. But she'd made her argument in the way that mattered most on the frontier. She'd survived. She'd kept her children alive. She'd proven that her calculation had been correct. She proved up in August of 1874, or filed her final patent, and became the legal owner of 80 acres she'd paid for with sweat and innovation and refusal to accept other people's limitations. The Territorial Land Office officially recognized her ownership, which meant that the land was hers, not provisional, not temporary, not subject to the whim of men like Blackwell. It was written in the books, recorded, permanent. She lived on that claim for another 32 years, raised her children, there saw them grow and marry, and start families of their own. The cabin around shed, or shed around cabin, depending on who you asked, lasted all those years without significant rot or structural failure. The air gap worked exactly as she had calculated. The wood stayed dry, the cabin stayed sound, and every winter brought proof that sometimes the traditional way of doing things isn't the only way or even the best way. Modern timber framers have since validated what Ingrid figured out through necessity. That 3-foot gap creates a thermal buffer that actually helps regulate temperature. Cooler in summer, warmer in winter. The ventilated storage prevents the moisture accumulation that destroys both firewood and structures. And the integrated design reduces heat loss compared to having to repeatedly open doors to access separate sheds in extreme weather. They've got computer models now that show exactly why it works, mathematical proofs of a principle that Ingrid understood through the simple application of survival. Ingrid just knew it worked because she didn't freeze to death, because her children made it through the winter healthy, because the cabin showed no sign of rot, because when spring came, the structure was still standing, still sound, still perfect in its functionality. Because she woke up every morning and looked at it and understood that she'd done something that no one else had been able to do. She'd solved a problem that the experts had said was unsolvable. Here's what that tells us about frontier innovation that most history books miss. The people who made real breakthroughs weren't usually the experts. They were the desperate ones. The ones who couldn't afford to follow conventional wisdom, because conventional wisdom assumed resources or help or safety margins they didn't have. Ingrid Halverson didn't revolutionize timber storage because she was smarter than Samuel Rohr or Jonas Pritchard. She did it because she had a problem they didn't have and couldn't solve without thinking differently. She was forced to think differently because thinking the way everyone else did would have meant freezing to death. That's the pattern you see over and over in the settlement period from 1840 to 1900. Women inventing new ways to preserve food because they couldn't rely on supply lines. Farmers developing drought-resistant techniques because rainfall was nothing like what they'd known back east. Builders figuring out how to construct shelter from materials that didn't exist in any manual or textbook. The frontier demanded innovation, not because people wanted to be innovative, but because traditional methods failed in non-traditional circumstances. When you face a problem that nobody else has solved, you become the expert. Your life experience becomes your credential. Your necessity becomes your qualification. And when you survive through that problem, when you make it through to the other side intact, you've proven something that no amount of formal education could have demonstrated. Ingrid died in 1906 at age 61, which was pretty good for someone who'd spent 33 years in Montana Territory doing manual labor that would break most modern people. She's buried in the Valley Cemetery next to Eric and two of her grandchildren who didn't make it past infancy. Her gravestone doesn't mention the shed, doesn't mention the innovation or the controversy or the fact that she proved every skeptic wrong through simple application of survival necessity. It just says beloved mother and homesteader, which probably would have suited her fine. But here's what they should have carved on that stone if they'd wanted to be accurate. She had a problem, so she fixed it. That's the whole story of the frontier, really. Problems that would kill you if you didn't solve them. Solutions that required you to ignore everyone telling you it couldn't be done, and the stubborn, desperate, brilliant people who survived by refusing to accept that traditional wisdom applied to non-traditional circumstances. The next time you're comfortable and warm with easy access to everything you need, remember that someone somewhere figured out how to stay alive when comfortable wasn't an option and easy didn't exist. They didn't do it for glory or recognition. They did it because the alternative was death, and they had children who needed them to keep breathing. That's worth remembering. That's worth preserving. That's the knowledge that deserves to be passed down to people who might find themselves in impossible situations, who might need to understand that sometimes the difference between freezing and surviving is the willingness to build something that makes perfect sense to you and no sense to anyone else until it works. Then it makes sense to everyone. The structure Ingrid built stood until 1927, when her grandson Niels dismantled it to salvage the lumber for a barn. By then it had served 54 Montana winters without failure, which is longer than most modern buildings last. The cabin itself burned in 1943, a wood stove mishap, ironic in its own way, given Blackwell's original fire hazard concerns, but photographs exist showing the whole setup intact. 3-foot gap extended roofline firewood stacked neat and dry in spaces that looked like they'd been designed by an engineer instead of a widow with an axe and a problem she couldn't ignore. The principle shows up in traditional architecture from cultures that never heard of Ingrid Halvorsen. Norwegian Stabor, with their elevated storage systems designed to protect grain and meat from moisture and rodents. Japanese Azumaya, with protective outer structures that regulate temperature and humidity. Mongolian Jur, with their layered insulation systems that kept people warm in climates more brutal than Montana. Humans keep reinventing the same solutions because the problems are universal. How do you store resources close to where you need them without destroying the structures you depend on? How do you balance accessibility against protection? How do you survive in places that actively try to kill you? Modern scholars have studied Ingrid Halvorsen's structure and found it to be ahead of its time in ways she couldn't have predicted. The 3-foot gap isn't just about fire safety or moisture control. It creates an air buffer that genuinely helps with temperature regulation. The ventilated design prevents the very moisture accumulation that destroys both firewood and wooden structures. The integrated design reduces heat loss in ways that separate sheds never could. What Ingrid did through desperate necessity, modern architecture departments now teach as an example of elegant problem solving. What she invented out of survival instinct has become a case study in sustainable design. The woman that Jonas Pritchard dismissed for being foolish and that Reverend Blackwell threatened with legal action had actually invented something that the future would eventually recognize as wise. But that recognition came too late for her to see it. She lived her life in relative obscurity, proving up her claim, raising her children, seeing a few other homesteaders copy her design because they understood its value. She never knew that her solution would outlast her life by decades, or that eventually people with engineering degrees would study how she'd figured out what they'd needed computers to understand. She just knew that when her daughter's fever spiked at 3 in the morning and her world contracted to the size of a desperate problem, she'd thought differently. She'd refused to choose between impossible options. She'd invented a third way. She'd created something from nothing but need and the refusal to accept that the rules written by people in different circumstances applied to her. And that third way, that refusal to accept the binary choice between rot and freezing, between tradition and death, had saved her family that winter, had saved her claim, had changed the way homesteaders in an entire valley understood how to live in a place that didn't want them alive. That's the lesson that history should have preserved, not the carpentry, not the architecture, not the engineering that modern analysis could validate. The lesson was about what happens when someone who has everything to lose refuses to believe that the experts have the only answer. When someone desperate enough to ignore conventional wisdom discovers that conventional wisdom had designed its solutions for people in very different circumstances. When someone faces a problem that nobody else has solved and discovers that maybe, just maybe, she's the only expert that matters. Ingrid Halvorson didn't know she was changing history. She was just trying to keep her children warm and her cabin dry while preventing herself from freezing to death during a Montana winter. She was solving the only problem that mattered in that moment. The fact that her solution to that problem became a design principle that outlasted her by more than a century is a consequence that she never expected and never sought. But it's the reason we remember her name. It's the reason her story matters. Because somewhere in the intersection of desperation and necessity and refusal to accept that her situation should be solved by someone else's rules, Ingrid Halvorson discovered that the expert on your problem is sometimes not the person with the most experience. It's the person who can't afford to stop solving it. It's the person who will keep working when everyone else has given up. It's the person who looks at an impossible situation and says, not no, not yes, but what if? What if there's a third way? What if I can create something that nobody else has created because nobody else has faced exactly this problem in exactly this situation? What if the rules that worked for someone else with different resources and different help don't apply to me? What if I'm the expert on my own survival? Ingrid Halvorson answered those questions by building a structure that stood for 54 years, by raising children who thrived in Montana, by proving her claim and owning her land, by changing the way an entire valley approached the problem of staying alive in a place that didn't want you alive. She did it not because she was smarter than the men who told her it was impossible. She did it because she was more desperate. And sometimes in the mathematics of survival, desperation is the only intelligence that matters.